Hey there and welcome back. If you're getting cozy right now, maybe the lights are low, maybe you've pulled a blanket up around you, maybe there's a cup of something warm nearby. Good. Stay where you are. Because tonight's story is one of those that works best when the world has gone quiet around you, and you can let yourself drift slowly into a house with very thick walls in a country 200 years ago, on a long autumn evening when the candles have just been lit. Tonight we are going to walk through the lives of 6 sisters, 6 women who were born princesses and who were not allowed, by their own family, to live the lives they had been promised. They called the place they grew up in the nunnery, not because it was religious, you understand, because it was closed, and they called the years that passed inside it the long years. So settle in. There is no hurry tonight. Here is the picture I want you to hold in your mind to begin with. It is the year 1810. Windsor Castle, on a slight rise above the River Thames, 20-odd miles west of London. October. The leaves in the great park have turned. The deer are bedding down for the night under the chestnut trees. The wind is picking up off the water, and the wind is finding every gap in every window of a building that is nearly 700 years old. Inside, in a long drawing room on the first floor of the south wing, 6 women are sitting up, or rather, 4 of them are sitting in a half circle around a fire, and one of them is in a separate room in a far wing of the castle, and one of them is 2,000 miles away in a small German court she cannot leave because Napoleon will not let her. Between the 6 of them, these women will produce exactly 1 child who survives to adulthood, and because of that single fact, the British monarchy will very nearly come to an end, and a small girl born 9 years from now in a bedroom in Kensington Palace will inherit a throne that had almost run out of heirs, and her name will be Victoria, and she will become the most reproductive royal in Europe, and her descendants will fill the thrones of every great country on the continent. But that is later. That is 40 years from where we are sitting tonight. Tonight is just 6 sisters, in a beautiful castle, in the middle of the long years. I want to give you their names, because the names matter, and because part of what I find so quietly devastating about this story is how often these women are written about as a unit, as a chorus, as the daughters, when they were each separately an entire person. The eldest is Charlotte, called the Princess Royal, in private letters called Royal, as if it were her actual Christian name. She is 44 years old. She has been married for 13 years to an enormous, frightening, politically inconvenient German prince. She has buried her only baby. She has not seen her mother or any of her sisters in 9 years. She is the one who is far away. Then there is Augusta, 41, cheerful, musical, the family laugher, in love for most of her adult life with a man she cannot publicly marry. Then Elizabeth, 39, the artist of the family, the one who designs the embroideries the others sew, the one who writes letters in which the unhappiness sits just beneath the beautifully turned sentences, like a stone beneath a still pond. Then Mary, 33, the beauty, the kind one, the one who sits at the bedsides. Then Sophia, 32, fragile, secretive, with a story she will carry to her grave. And then the youngest, Amelia, 27, loved by everyone, loved especially by her father, and in the wing of the castle she has been moved to so that she does not have to be carried up the stairs anymore, dying. She has been dying for 6 years, and now, in this autumn of 1810, she has only days left. These 6 women are the subject of tonight's story, not their parents, not the king who is upstairs in another wing of the castle losing what is left of his mind, not the queen who is sitting downstairs in a chair she has been sitting in for 30 years. The daughters. We are going to spend the evening with the daughters, because they were the ones who lived in the house. They were the ones who carried it. We are going to walk into the bright, busy nursery on the top floor of Buckingham House in the 1770s, where 6 little girls in muslin dresses are being raised. We are going to watch the first cracks open, We are going to sit in this same castle drawing room in the 1790s with the fire built up and the candles lit and the embroidery frames at every chair, while 6 daughters quietly, year by year, by inches none of them at first names, become the women you can see in this room tonight. We are going to meet a princess who fell in love with an army officer, and a princess who hid a child, waited so long for the wedding she had been promised at 16, that when it finally came in her 40s, her body could no longer give her the children she had spent her whole adult life waiting to have. We are going to sit with each of them at the end of her life, because part of what I want to give you tonight is what it was like to be the one who survived, the one who was left to put away the embroidery, the one who lit the last candle in the long darkening row of them. We are going to find out what it cost, the long staying, the long mourning, the slow leaving of one another, year by year, until the last sister was alone, and we are going to arrive, at the end of it all, at a small girl in a pinafore in a shabby suite of rooms at Kensington Palace, to whom one by one 6 aunts came to visit, and looked, and understood, each of them in her own particular way, that this small girl was the answer to the question their own lives had been asking, and not been allowed to answer. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are tonight, and what time it is for you, and what you can hear outside your window, whether you are in a flat in a city or a house in the country, whether it is winter where you are or summer, whether you are here to drift into sleep, or to spend a long evening with 6 sisters in a house that never quite let them go. I am very glad you are with me, and if you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you do not miss the next story. Now, let us go back to that night in 1810. Let us go back to the windows lit yellow along a terrace, and to the 4 sisters in the drawing room, and to what they were waiting for, which was not anything that was going to come. Windsor Castle, on the evening of the 27th of October 1810, is lit. The windows along the north terrace glow yellow against the autumn sky. The river below the castle is dark. The park beyond the river is dark. The town of Windsor, spread out along the slope beneath the castle walls, is quiet, with a few lamps moving in the streets and the smoke going up straight from the chimneys. In the Queen's drawing room on the 1st floor, 4 princesses sit in silence. It is a little after 9 in the evening. The fire has been built up, quite high. The candles have been lit. The embroidery frames have been brought out and set beside each chair, with the basket of silks in the middle of the carpet, so that any sister can reach for any colour. None of them is embroidering tonight. They are just sitting. They have learned over the last decade how to sit without doing anything for very long stretches of time. I want you to picture this room with me, because it is the room these women are going to be in for most of this story. It is panelled in pale wood. It has tall windows, 3 of them, looking south over the terrace and the park. There are heavy red curtains drawn against the night, and a fire screen worked by Princess Augusta in 1792 when she was 24, showing a vase of flowers in the kind of careful realistic stitching that takes a young woman about a year of evenings. There is a pianoforte in the corner, the same pianoforte Augusta has been playing for 30 years. There is a writing desk under the window where the daughters do their correspondence in the mornings. There is a small black and white spaniel asleep on the rug by the fire, who belongs in a manner of speaking to all 6 sisters, and who will outlive most of them. The walls are hung with pictures, family pictures, all of them, painted at various points across the last 40 years. The family on the lawn at Kew, the family at Christmas, the Princess Royal at 12:20, the Princess Royal in her wedding dress at 31, Augusta playing the harp, Mary as a small child sitting on a footstool, Amelia, 3 different Amelias, 3 different ages, all of them with the same fair curling hair and the same direct blue eyes. Augusta is sitting closest to the fire. She is 41. She has put on a little weight in her 30s, the small, careful weight of a woman who walks every morning and eats moderately and has nothing else to do with her body. Her hair is still mostly dark. She has her embroidery in her lap and is looking into the fire and not speaking. Augusta has not laughed properly, the family will note later, since the previous spring. Elizabeth is in the chair beside her. She is 39, she is the artist of the family, and at this period in her life she is producing the most accomplished work of her career, although nobody outside the nunnery will ever see it. She is thin. Her face has a permanent slight downturn at the corners of the mouth that the painters have learned to soften. She is reading in that distracted way that means the book is not actually getting read. A volume of devotional poetry that she has read before. Mary is the third sister in the room. She is 33. She is the most beautiful of all of them, and the one who looks the youngest. She is also the most exhausted. She has spent most of the last 6 months in another wing of the castle, by Amelia's bed, taking the night watches when nobody else can take them, reading aloud to her dying sister from the books they had read together as children. She is here in the drawing room only for the next 2 hours, after which she will go back upstairs and sit with Amelia again until dawn. Sophia is the fourth sister. She is 32. She is small, dark, fragile, and unwell, as she has been unwell for nearly all her adult life. There is a story behind that, a story we will come to, and the story is the reason that Sophia, alone of the sisters, never speaks to her mother about her health unless she absolutely has to. Sophia does not embroider. Sophia keeps a small dog on her lap in the evenings and reads, when she can read, books her sisters bring her from the library. The Princess Royal is not in this room. She is in Stuttgart, in a small palace in a small German state, queen of a country she did not choose. Her letters to her sisters arrive irregularly, sometimes 6 months apart, smuggled through the continent by diplomats and merchants, and anyone who can be trusted by a Britain that has been at war with most of Europe for 15 years. The 4 sisters in this room have not seen her in 9 years. They will not see her again for nearly another 9. In another wing of the castle at this moment, the youngest princess is dying. Her name is Amelia. She is 27. She has been ill for 6 years with tuberculosis, the slow wasting disease that has no cure in 1810, and that will not have a cure for another century and a half. She has reached the stage where she can no longer get out of bed, where she does not eat, where she sleeps in a half-sitting position because lying flat makes the cough worse, where the physicians come and go and shake their heads and prescribe the same useless tinctures they have been prescribing for months. Beloved, this is the house tonight. This is the shape of the family in the autumn of 1810. The 4 sisters in their chairs around the fire, each of them holding an embroidery frame she is not using, each of them waiting, in her own way, for a life that has become a long and beautifully furnished and quietly unbearable waiting. That is the picture. Hold it in your mind. Now we are going to go all the way back to where these 4 women were small, and to where they were happy, because they were, all of them, very happy once. Just one piece of context first before we go into the nursery, because to understand the daughters, you have to understand the family they were born into. Their father was George III, the 3rd Hanoverian king, 23 years old and unmarried when he came to the throne in 1760. Their mother was Sophie Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a small, plain, bright, pious German princess of 17, brought over from a tiny duchy in northern Germany in 1761, and married to him on the day of her arrival. The marriage worked. He never strayed. She gave him 15 children. They built, between them, the most domestically respectable royal household England had seen in a century, and the country, after a long run of unhappy royal couples, did not quite know what to do with them. 3 of the children died young. 12 survived. 6 of those 12 were boys, who would grow up to be wild and scandalous in every direction, and 6 of them were girls, and the girls are who we are here for tonight. The first daughter was born on the 29th of September 1766 at Buckingham House in London. They called her Charlotte, after her mother. In the family she was known as the Princess Royal, the courtesy title given to the eldest daughter of a reigning monarch, but in private correspondence Her parents and her siblings called her royal, as though that were her Christian name. And that was how she signed her own letters all her life. She was a pretty baby. She was placid. She slept through the night from 6 weeks. She grew into a gentle, stubborn, slightly melancholy child. She was fond of her mother. She was adored by her father. She learned German and French and English, because the royal nursery at Buckingham House was trilingual, and the children moved between the 3 languages depending on which parent was in the room and which governess was on duty. She learned to draw, and she drew well. The harpsichord came easily to her. The tambour frame, the small embroidery hoop a girl of her class would have spent many hours of her life leaning over, became second nature. Her embroidery by her mid-teens would produce pieces that were displayed discreetly in the royal apartments and that are still preserved, some of them, in the royal collection today. If you ever go to Windsor and the right cabinets are open on the right day, you can still see the small, careful stitches she made when she was 16. There was, on the Princess Royal, a particular weight that the younger sisters would not carry. She was the example. She was the first. Whatever she did would be done again by her sisters, and whatever she failed to do would become the shape of their own failures. If she made a brilliant marriage, the younger 5 could hope to follow. If she did not, they would watch the window close. The weight did not at first show itself. She was a happy girl. There are portraits of her from the 1770s and early 1780s that show a round-faced, rather serious young woman with her mother's complexion and her father's blue eyes. She stands beside her younger sisters in white muslin dresses with blue ribbons. In the portraits, she is nearly always the one looking most directly at the painter, as though she understands already that her job is to be seen. Now I want to take you up to the nursery, because the nursery at Buckingham House in the 1770s is one of the most remarkable rooms in royal history, and it deserves its own moment. It deserves its own minute of warm, lamp-lit memory, because for these 6 girls, this is where everything good happens. Whatever comes after, whatever locked rooms and refused proposals and slow disappointments and dying youngest sisters lie ahead of them, the nursery at Buckingham House in the 1770s is where they were unambiguously, simply, well known to themselves loved. Picture it with me. It is not grand. It is not large. It is a set of 3 or 4 connected rooms on the top floor of the house, with dormer windows looking out over the gardens towards what is now Green Park. The walls are painted a pale soft green, the colour of new leaves in April. The floors are scrubbed boards, softened with rugs that are changed and laundered more often than the rugs in any other room in the house, because there are children spilling things on them. There are fires in every room, kept up by a special set of nursery maids who do nothing else. There are beds, and there are cots, and there are wooden toys made by the carpenters on the royal estates, dolls and wooden horses, and little carriages with wooden wheels that the older brothers have wheeled into walls and chipped the paint off of. There are books in 3 languages, stacked on low shelves where the children can reach them. And there is in the central room a long table where 11, 12, 13, eventually 15 children at various ages sit down to eat together, in the kind of cheerful, loud disorder that any large family will recognize. The arrangements were striking by the standards of the time. The children slept in shared rooms. The older ones helped mind the younger ones. They were dressed plainly, in muslin and wool. They ate plain food, plain mutton, plain bread, plain vegetables from the palace gardens. No French sauces, no rich puddings. They ran barefoot in the grass at Kew in the summer. There is a story, well attested, of the small Princess Royal at 6 years old being found in the royal kitchens with a piece of stolen plum cake in her hand, and an extremely guilty expression on her face, and the head cook bowing solemnly and pretending he had not seen anything at all. And the children were happy. By every account, by every letter from every tutor, and every governess who served in the royal household in the 1770s, this nursery worked. The brothers and the sisters loved each other. The older princes were affectionate with their younger sisters, walking them down to dinner and tying their sashes and intervening for them when the governess was being too strict. The sisters were allies and confidants. And the particular bond that developed between the 6 girls in the years when they were all small and all at home together was a bond that would sustain them through all the unhappier decades to come. Princess Augusta was born on the 8th of November, 1768, at Buckingham House. She was the 2nd daughter and the 6th child. She arrived into a nursery that already contained 4 brothers and 1 sister, and she was, from the beginning, the most good-humoured of the 6 girls. She was cheerful. She was affectionate. She laughed easily. She was, in the way that some children simply are, the one who could be counted on to find the pleasure in whatever was happening. Her sisters leaned on her. Her brothers teased her but loved her. Her mother, who was naturally grave and sometimes severe, visibly relaxed in Augusta's company in a way she did not relax with the more serious Princess Royal or the more reserved Elizabeth. Augusta had musical talent. Of all the sisters, she was the one who could play properly, who learned the pianoforte and later the harp with real skill, who could sight-read a complicated piece and give a performance that was more than merely competent. She played duets with her brothers in the drawing room. She accompanied her sisters when they sang. In a family where music was one of the few permitted forms of display, her musical gift gave her a kind of standing among her siblings that the others, even the Princess Royal, did not quite have. There is a small portrait of her at the harp, painted when she was about 20, which I find one of the most affecting pictures of any of the sisters. She is half smiling. The harp is enormous beside her. She looks like a person who is, for the moment, exactly where she wants to be. Elizabeth was born 2 years later, in May 1770. She was the 3rd daughter, the 7th child, and she was, by contrast with the cheerful Augusta, the most inward of the 6. She was reflective. She was artistic. From childhood, she had an eye for design and colour that the rest of the family noticed and respected, and as she grew older, she developed this into a serious accomplishment. She painted. She drew. The patterns for the embroideries the sisters worked on together were her designs. In later years, the gardens at Frogmore and the interiors of her mother's private rooms were her plans, drawn with a confidence that suggested she should have been an architect or a decorator in any life that had allowed it. There is a quality in her surviving sketches, a precision, a balance, an instinct for proportion that you do not learn at the embroidery frame. It is the eye of someone who would have been very good at any of half a dozen professions in any age in which a princess could have a profession. Elizabeth was also, from her teenage years, unhappy. The unhappiness was not dramatic. It was the quiet, structural unhappiness of a person with an artistic temperament who finds herself confined to a life in which her gifts have no outlet that the culture will recognize. She could design. She could draw. She could imagine elaborate schemes of improvement and decoration that she could never actually build, because princesses did not build anything, and the rooms she inhabited were not, in any real sense, hers to alter. The frustration sat in her letters. It sat in the long periods of what her sisters called low spirits, the weeks when Elizabeth would not come down to dinner and would not speak at the tambour frame in the evenings. Augusta knew how to draw her out. The Princess Royal did not. The mother, who was busy with the younger children, often did not notice. The 3 elder sisters, by the middle 1780s, had become a tight little group. Royal was 20, Augusta was 18, Elizabeth was 16. They walked together in the gardens at Kew in the mornings, 3 young women in muslin dresses with their arms linked, talking about nothing very much. They read together in the long afternoons. They took their music lessons together. They worked on their embroideries together, sharing designs and patterns and the long silent hours of small careful stitching that the life of a royal daughter contains so much of. Mary was born in April 1776. Sophia was born in November 1777. Amelia was born in August 1783. These 3 younger sisters, arriving 5, 6 and 12 years after Elizabeth, formed a second generation within the nursery. They were loved by their older sisters with the particular tenderness that older sisters have for much younger ones. They were also, in practical terms, largely raised by those older sisters, because the parents' attention was already stretched thin across so many children. Mary was the beauty of the family. Even as a very small child, the court observers who recorded such things noted that she was exceptionally pretty, with a clear pink and white complexion, fine bones, and a quiet, grave manner that added dignity to her beauty. She was also, from the beginning, the kindest of the sisters. She was the one who brought soup to the nursery maid who was ill. She was the one who sat with the younger children through nightmares. She was the one who in adulthood would sit with Amelia through the long decline, hour after hour, year after year, without complaint and without public acknowledgement. Mary's particular gift, I think, looking at the whole arc of her life, was a kind of practical kindness that had no use for praise. She did the thing that needed doing. She did it again the next day. She would do it again, in old age, when there was no one left who needed her to do it, just out of long habit. Sophia was smaller, darker, livelier than Mary, and more inward than Augusta. She was clever. She read more than any of her sisters. She wrote poetry that she showed to no one. She was also, from her teens, physically fragile in a way that her sisters were not. She suffered from recurring headaches, stomach pains, and bouts of what the family called nervous collapse, symptoms that the physicians of the day diagnosed variously and treated ineffectually. In her adult life, Sophia would carry a reputation for mystery that none of her sisters quite matched. The root of the mystery, as we shall see, would be something that happened to her in her 20s, that the family decided, by silent consensus, not to speak of. Amelia was the youngest, and she was everyone's favourite. She was born in 1783, nearly 7 years after Sophia, at a time when the household had thought the babies were over. She was a surprise. She was a delight. She had fair curly hair, blue eyes, and an almost preternatural sweetness of temper that everyone who met her in her short life remarked on. Her father adored her with a particular, unguarded love. The king had begun, by the 1790s, the retreat into privacy that would characterize his last lucid years, and the one person he unambiguously wanted by his side at all times was his youngest daughter. He called her his Emily. He had small portraits of her painted almost every year. He carried one in his pocket. In his good periods and his bad, in the lucid intervals and in the dark places he could not be reached, the name he most often called for, when he called for anyone, was Amelia. The 3 younger sisters grew up inside the affection of the 3 elder sisters, and this produced over time the extraordinary internal bond that would sustain all 6 of them through decades of unhappy adult life. The Princess Royal taught Mary to read. Augusta taught Sophia to play the pianoforte. Elizabeth taught Amelia to draw. The older sisters took the younger ones on their morning walks in the garden, dressed their dolls, sang them to sleep, comforted them when the nursery maids were harsh. The bond between them, by the 1790s, was so strong that the sisters functioned, in many practical senses, as a single unit. What happened to one happened to all 6. What was withheld from one was withheld from all 6. I want you to hold that in your mind. The picture of those 6 small heads bent over a single book, or 6 small bodies arranged on a rug in front of a fire, or 6 small voices in the corridor in a kind of disorganized chorus. Because everything that comes next happens to them as a group, as much as it happens to them individually. They had, before they had anything else, each other. And whatever else is taken from them across the decades that follow, that, the 6 of them as a unit, is the thing that survives. Now we have to go into the autumn of 1788, because that is the autumn that broke them. The summer of 1788 begins normally. The king is 50. He is in good health. He rides every day. He walks long distances in the gardens at Kew. He eats his plain mutton and his plain bread. He sleeps well. In June, he travels with the family to Cheltenham for a month to take the waters there. A fashionable spa treatment meant more as pleasure than as cure. He enjoys himself. He returns to Windsor refreshed. And then, in October, something begins to go wrong. It starts with a pain in the stomach. He complains of it at dinner one evening. He is unable to eat. He retires early to bed. In the days that follow, the pain recurs. He becomes agitated. He cannot sleep. He begins to talk very fast, to interrupt himself, to follow one subject into another without returning to the first. His speech becomes a torrent. His attendants cannot keep up. By November, he is out of his mind. I want to come at this not from the king's side, and not from the queen's side, but from the daughter's side, because that is whose story we are following. The 6 sisters are at Windsor when the worst of the first attack happens. The Princess Royal is 22, Augusta is 20, Elizabeth is 18, Mary is 12, Sophia is 11, Amelia is 5. Try, just for a second, to imagine what that autumn was like for them. They had grown up, all 6 of them, in a house that worked. The father came up to the nursery in the evenings to read to them. The mother came in the mornings to sit with them. The brothers and sisters were a chaotic, warm crowd of children eating plain food and running on lawns. The household was one of the most domestically functional royal households in Europe. They had been told, in the small ways that children are told these things, that they were lucky. And in the autumn of 1788, in a single month, the father whom they had all loved became a stranger. He shouted in a part of the house they were not allowed into. They could hear him through the walls at night. They saw the doctors hurrying along the corridors with their bags. They saw their mother coming out of the sick room after hours of absence, with her face wiped clean and her mouth set, and they understood without being told that they were not to ask, "Picture being 12-year-old Mary in this house. Picture being 11-year-old Sophia. Picture being 5-year-old Amelia. The frightened mother. The shouting father somewhere down the corridor. The older sisters trying, gently, to keep things normal, to keep the schoolroom running, to read the bedtime stories, to keep the embroidery moving forward. Picture the candles in their pewter holders, the cold linen sheets, the white winter mornings with the frost on the inside of the windows, and somewhere down the corridor a sound nobody is going to explain to you. The Princess Royal, 22, took on the running of the day-to-day life of the younger sisters that autumn, because somebody had to. She got Amelia to bed at night. She read to her in German when she could not sleep. She sat with Sophia, who had begun to have stomach pains, and made her drink the warm milk the cook brought up to the nursery. She kept the embroidery routine going for Mary, who at 12 was old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough to need ordinary tasks to organize her around. Augusta played the pianoforte in the small drawing room next to the nursery in the long evenings of November and December 1788, very quietly, with the door open, so that the younger ones could hear it from their beds and know that something normal was still happening somewhere in the house. Elizabeth, in her own way, drew. She produced that autumn a series of careful pencil drawings of the gardens at Kew under snow that survive in the royal collection. They are precise and dry-eyed. You would not know from looking at them that anything was wrong. The 6 sisters changed in that autumn, in a way they could not have described at the time, and that they would return to in their letters for the rest of their lives. Their father, whom they had loved, was not their father anymore. Their mother, who had been warm in the way that mothers are warm with small children, had become a woman carrying a burden so heavy that it had begun to press everything else out of her. And the family, the perfectly domestic family they had grown up in, had cracked in a single autumn, in a way that could not be repaired, even when the king, against all expectation, recovered the following spring. He did recover. By March of 1789, he was lucid again. He returned to his duties. The country rejoiced. The family pretended because pretending was what royal families did, but the 6 daughters did not. ever again quite trust the foundations of the house they were standing in. They had felt it move once. They were going to feel it move again. They had been quietly, permanently taught to brace. This is the moment, although nobody understands it at the time, when the nunnery begins. Not in any room, not with any decision, just in the daughters' new understanding that the house could come apart, and in their mother's new frightened refusal, from this winter onwards, to lose anyone else. Now I want to talk about what was being withheld from the daughters from about 1790 onwards, because this is the part of the story that, when I came across it, made me put the book down and sit for a moment. By 1790, the elder three sisters were in their 20s. The Princess Royal was 24, Augusta was 22, Elizabeth was 20. In any other royal household in Europe, matches would already have been negotiated, treaties drafted, travel arranged. It was the normal pattern. A princess of a reigning house was married off in her late teens or very early 20s to a prince of a comparable house, in a political alliance that served the interests of both countries and brought honour to the family on both sides. The offers, when they came, were perfectly reasonable. The Prince of Orange, the heir to the Dutch stadholderate, had been considered for the Princess Royal. Various minor German princes had been proposed for Augusta and Elizabeth. A match with the Prussian royal family had been floated for the eldest two together, as a means of strengthening the anti-French coalition in the 1790s. Spain had tentatively been discussed, though the Catholic barrier ruled Spain out. Each proposal was examined. Each proposal was deferred. Each proposal, after a period of consideration so long that the initial interest on the other side had begun to cool, was quietly allowed to lapse. No one, at first, noticed a pattern. The king was ill, intermittently. The wars with revolutionary France made every negotiation more difficult. There were plausible reasons for every individual delay. It was only when the Princess Royal reached 25 and was still unmarried, and Augusta reached 23, and Elizabeth reached 21, that the pattern began to be visible. The people in the know began to say quietly to each other that the Queen did not mean to let them go. There were practical reasons, ones the Queen herself believed. The King needed his daughter's care, increasingly, even between the major attacks. The younger princes were wild, scandalous, expensive. The family needed the daughters at home, the Queen told herself, to preserve the domestic atmosphere the King relied on for his sanity. If she sent Amelia away, what would happen to the King? I have a lot of sympathy for the position, taken in isolation. I have very little sympathy for what it cost. The daughters, at first, did not resent the delays. They had grown up in a close, affectionate family. They did not want to leave their parents. The idea of marriage to a stranger in a foreign court was frightening, and the deferral of that marriage was, for the older three, a relief. They were in no hurry. They had each other. They had their embroidery and their music and their long walks in the gardens at Kew and Windsor. But as the 1790s passed, and the Princess Royal reached 30 and was still unmarried, and Augusta reached 28, and Elizabeth reached 26, the mood among the sisters began to change. They watched their contemporaries, the daughters of the great Whig and Tory families, marry. They watched younger cousins marry. They watched the nursery maids marry, and they understood slowly that the years of their lives in which they might reasonably have expected to have children of their own were running out. The window their mother had been quietly holding shut was about to close permanently. When it did, they would be on the wrong side of it forever. Picture this in the daughters' own minds. Picture being Augusta at 25, looking at her sister Royal at 27, and understanding for the first time that Royal might never marry, and that if Royal never married, no door would be opened for any of them. Picture being Elizabeth at 23, with her drawings and her plans and her quiet artistic ambition, and understanding that all of it was going to happen, if it happened at all, inside the same set of rooms she had been sketching since she was 16. Picture being Mary at 16, watching the older three, and beginning, with a child's delayed clarity, to understand what was about to be true of her own life as well. Their education had not prepared them to push back. That, looking at the whole arc of the story, is the other piece I keep coming back to. They had been taught French, German, embroidery, music, drawing, the catechism of the Church of England. They had been taught to be charming hostesses and well-married consorts. They had not been taught Latin, mathematics beyond household accounting, history, political theory, the law of marriage settlements, or anything else that would have given them the intellectual tools to argue formally against what was being done to them. They had been raised, in other words, to be exactly the kind of daughters who would not be able to leave on their own initiative, and they had been raised that way by parents who almost certainly believed they were doing what was loving and proper. Which is often how loving people do harm. I want to take you now, for a long, slow moment, into the daily life of Windsor in this period, because it is the daily life that gives you the texture of what was happening to them. The big political reasons, the king's illness, the queen's fear, the war with France, all of those are explanations, but the actual experience of the nunnery, the texture of it, the smell and sound and feel of it, is in the days. And the days, 20,000 of them, repeating with very small variations across 30 years, are the actual subject of this story. Settle in for this part. There is no plot to it. That is the point. Windsor Castle in the 1790s is the family's principal residence. The king prefers it to Buckingham House in London. The family's private apartments are in the south wing, with windows looking out over the Long Walk, the great avenue that stretches 3 miles away from the castle into the park. The daily routine for the sisters is rigid. They rise at 7. They are dressed by their maids in morning gowns of white muslin. They breakfast at 8, with their mother, in a small panelled room on the first floor. Breakfast is tea, bread and butter, and a boiled egg. Between 9 and 11, they walk on the terrace. Between 11 and 1, they attend to their private occupations, which is to say their letters, their embroidery, their music practice, and their reading. At 1, they join their mother for the formal drawing-room hour, at which any visitors may be received. From 2 to 3, they dine. From 3 to 5, they walk again, or drive out in the carriage if the weather is bad. From 5 to 7, they change for dinner. Dinner is at 7. The evening from 8 onwards is spent in the Queen's drawing-room, with embroidery and music and reading aloud, until bedtime at 11. This routine, almost unchanged from 1790 to 1810, is the shape of their days. 20 years of it. Every day. The same walks, the same meals, the same drawing room in the same chairs with the same embroidery frames. Read that paragraph again, slowly. 20 years. Every day. The same walks. Imagine your own life arranged in this way. Imagine knowing, at 25, that the shape of your day at 55 will be the shape of the day you are living right now. The sisters know the Long Walk so intimately that they can say, from the position of a cloud over a particular tree, what time it is within 5 minutes. They know the castle corridors the way a person knows her own hands. They know every painting, every chair, every footman, every gardener, every tree in the park, with a depth of familiarity that would be soothing in any other context. In the context of their unchanging lives, it becomes, slowly, suffocating. And yet, and this is the thing that I find most poignant about their letters from this period, they did not, on the whole, complain, not in any direct way. The complaints come out sideways, a wry phrase, a small dark joke, a description of a particularly long winter afternoon that goes on for half a page before it occurs to you that nothing has happened in the description, that the writer is recording, with great precision, a slow nothing. The visitors are few. The king does not like strangers. The family dines alone except on court days when the great officers of the household are present, and on birthdays when the whole family gathers. The princes, when they are at Windsor, enliven the dinners and the evenings. But the princes are often away. leading their own dissolute lives in London or Brighton or the regimental messes of the army. And when the princes are away, the sisters are left with their parents and with each other and with the embroidery. There are small pleasures, a new dress, a new piece of music, a concert held in the castle by visiting musicians, a performance by a travelling troupe from London brought up specially to amuse the family, a ride in the park on a particularly fine horse, the arrival of a letter from a cousin in Germany. These things are recorded in the sisters' letters with the emphasis that a woman in a closed life gives to the small events that differentiate one week from the next. And there is the garden. Frogmore, the little house in the grounds of Windsor, becomes in the 1790s a project that the sisters throw themselves into. It is given to the daughters as their own private retreat. They decorate it. They furnish it. They plant its gardens. Elizabeth, who has the artistic gift, designs the interiors. The Princess Royal embroiders the hangings. Augusta chooses the music room. Mary arranges the flowers. Sophia, when she is well enough, arranges the books. It is the one project in their early adult lives that is entirely their own, and they love it with the fierce, disproportionate love that any closed person gives to the one small thing she is allowed to shape. You can still go to Frogmore today. The little house sits in its own gardens, restored and preserved, and you can stand in the rooms Elizabeth designed, and the music room Augusta chose. And the small things they put on the walls and the small careful colours they chose for the upholstery are still there, faintly, beneath the later restorations. Three sisters in their 20s making a doll's house out of the one corner of the world they had been allowed to keep. But even Frogmore is not a way out. Frogmore is on the estate. Frogmore is within the boundary that has been quietly drawn around their lives. The sisters walk to it in the mornings, and they return to the castle in the evenings, and the unchanging routine resumes. The word nunnery first appears in a letter from Elizabeth to her brother, the Prince of Wales, in 1803. She uses it almost casually. She refers to the routines of Windsor as the rules of the nunnery. She is making a joke. Her brother, reading the letter in his rooms at Carlton House in London, does not quite laugh. He understands what his sister is saying, and he keeps the letter, and the word passes, through the correspondence of the family, into the private vocabulary of all six sisters. The nunnery. Their name for it. It is not dramatic. It is not bitter. It is in the way of all real names descriptive. They live in an enclosed community of women. They keep a daily routine that is as fixed as any religious rule. They do not marry. They do not take lovers, or at least they are not supposed to. They devote themselves to a single, aging, ailing male patriarch whose care consumes most of their waking hours. They perform a round of domestic duties and accomplishments that are socially useless outside the enclosure, and they know, because they have been inside long enough to know, that they are not going to be released in any timely way, and that the release, when it comes, will come too late to matter. Another. The letters between them use the term without explanation. The Princess Royal from Stuttgart asks for news of the nunnery. Augusta writes to her Württemberg sister about a small piece of drama in the nunnery this week. Elizabeth, who coined the term, returns to it most often. She refers to the nunnery's new embroidery project. She refers to the nunnery supper menu. She refers once, in a dark letter to Augusta, that the sisters passed around privately, to the possibility of perpetual vows in the nunnery, by which she meant the possibility that none of them would ever be released at all. The sisters develop in this period a kind of wry humour about their condition that would be familiar to any group of women living in close quarters under a shared constraint. They make jokes about the routines. The humour is not cruel. It is survival. It is the humour that any closed community develops to make the enclosure bearable. The humour that nuns themselves, in actual convents, have developed across the centuries. I want to give you the sensory texture of these years because the sisters wrote about it in detail, And because part of what is so peculiar about a life like this is that the small things, in the absence of any large things, become enormous. They get filed away in memory, with a precision that would be ridiculous in a different kind of life, and that, in this kind of life, is the entire content of the days. The smell of beeswax on the polished floors of the corridors at Windsor, applied every morning by the housemaids before the family came down, the smell of the ink in the writing desks, and the slight sweetness of the sealing wax that they used to close their letters to their brothers, the smell of the lavender that was tucked into their linen presses to keep the moths away, and that came out on every fresh nightgown for 50 years. The taste of the weak tea their mother preferred, served always with thin slices of buttered bread, in the small panelled breakfast room with the view over the terrace. The feel of the silk of their mother's chair, against which Mary or Sophia would lean when they sat at her feet on the long evenings. The sound of the household was specific and unchanging, the clocks in every room ticking at slightly different rates, so that any walk through the castle was accompanied by a faint percussive disagreement of seconds. The footsteps of the footmen in the corridors, learned by ear so well that the sisters could tell which footman was passing without looking up. The wind in the chimneys when the autumn storms came, the rain on the glass of the long windows, the call of the deer in the park at dusk, the bells of St. George's Chapel ringing the hours. They knew these sounds the way a sailor knows the sounds of his ship. The light at Windsor was a particular thing too. The sisters wrote about it often. The grey-gold light of an English summer morning falling on the polished oak of the gallery floors, the clear cold blue of a winter dawn, when the frost lay on the terrace and they could see, from their dressing-room windows, the gardeners breaking the ice on the pond in the deer park. The slow blue dusks of the long northern summer evenings, when they walked on the terrace before dinner and watched the bats come out from the eaves of the towers above them, the soft yellow lamplight of the drawing-room in the long winter evenings, the candles in their silver holders, the fire crackling, the embroidery frames with their pools of light, the silence broken only by the sound of needles passing through the linen and the occasional turning of a page. The food was plain and unchanging, boiled mutton on Mondays, roast beef on Thursdays, plain fish on Fridays, plum pudding on Christmas, the same dishes, the same days, the same week after week, year after year, the menu of a household that did not entertain and did not need to vary. The cook at Windsor served the family for 40 years. He knew by 1810 what each of the daughters preferred. The sisters joked in their letters that the cook was a kind of unofficial archivist of their lives. He could remember which Sunday in which year had featured a particular pudding, and he was sometimes the only person in the house who could remember at all. The Prince of Wales, their eldest brother, is their principal outside correspondent in these years. He is a difficult man, vain, self-indulgent, politically treacherous. He is also, to his sisters, unexpectedly and consistently kind. He writes to them. He sends them presents. He intercedes on their behalf when he can. When his own household is set up, he invites them to visit him at Brighton and at Carlton House. A particular effort is made, in the 1800s, to bring them out of the nunnery for a few weeks at a time, to balls, to dinners, to the theatre, to the kinds of social events they had been kept from for most of their adult lives. The sisters love these excursions. They also understand that they are excursions, not releases. They return to Windsor after each visit. The routines resume. The tambour frames come out. The terrace walks begin again. And the nunnery absorbs them back into itself as if they had never left. What they write about in their letters, increasingly, is each other. They are each other's closest companions and also each other's only witnesses. When one of them is unhappy, the others know. When one of them is ill, the others sit with her. When one of them receives a letter that brings news of a death or a birth in the outside world, the others gather to hear it read. They are a small court of sisters. They are also, in ways that are harder to name, a small kind of family that has had to become a substitute for the larger families they were never permitted to build. In 1797, after years of failed negotiations and postponed proposals, a match is finally made for the Princess Royal. The bridegroom is Frederick, hereditary Prince of Württemberg. He is 39 years old. He is a widower, his first wife having died in Russian exile under circumstances the Württemberg court has carefully refused to explain. He is enormous. He weighs over 300 pounds. He is physically frightening, a slab of a man whose height and bulk astonish everyone who meets him. He is also, at this point in his life, politically important, because his small German principality occupies a strategic position in the wars with revolutionary France. The Princess Royal is 31. She has waited 9 years beyond the age at which her contemporaries married. She is not in a position to refuse. She accepts. I want you to sit with the Princess Royal for a moment in this period, because she is going to leave the story geographically in just a few weeks. She is going to disappear into a small German court and write letters home for the next 30 years, and only physically appear in this story twice more. So this is in a way the last full moment we get with her. She is 31. She has been the head girl of the nursery for as long as she can remember. She has helped raise 5 younger sisters, 3 of whom are still teenagers, and she is about to leave them. She has been told all her life that her marriage will be a great political event, and she has been kept at home year after year while the great political event was deferred and deferred again, and now it is finally happening, and the man she is going to marry is 40 pounds a year overweight and politically embarrassing, and has a previous wife who died under suspicious circumstances in Russia. She is going to a country whose language she speaks, but whose people she has never met. She is going through a Europe at war. She is leaving everyone she has ever known. She does not protest. She has not been raised to protest. She accepts the match. She accepts the dress. She accepts the wedding day. And she carries through, in front of everyone, the careful, composed performance she has been practicing her entire adult life. The wedding takes place on the 18th of May 1797 at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. The Princess Royal wears a white silk dress with silver embroidery that she has, in part, embroidered herself, the sleeves and the hem worked over the previous winter in the long evenings at Windsor, when she had begun to understand that this match, finally, was going to happen. Her father gives her away with tears in his eyes that he does not quite manage to hide. Her 5 younger sisters stand behind her in matching white gowns. Each of them, in turn, kisses her at the end of the ceremony. Each kiss is both a blessing and a parting. Augusta and Elizabeth and Mary and Sophia and Amelia all understand in that moment that their elder sister is the first of them to escape, and that the escape has cost her everything. She leaves for Württemberg within weeks. The journey is long and dangerous. She travels through a Europe at war, changing carriages at frontier after frontier, pursued by rumours that her new husband is a brute. When she arrives at Stuttgart, she is received formally by her husband's court. She meets her stepchildren, 4 of them, from her husband's first marriage. She meets her new sister-in-law. She meets the small crowd of German courtiers who will now be her daily world. She sits down that night in an unfamiliar bedroom, in an unfamiliar palace, and she writes a letter home that survives today. It is a letter that is careful and cheerful, and that contains, if you read it with attention, a grief so tightly controlled that it reads 2 centuries later as the most restrained scream in the royal archive. She is pregnant within the year. The baby, a girl, is stillborn in April 1798. The Princess Royal nearly dies herself. She recovers slowly. She writes to her sisters. She tells them about the loss. She tells them she is well cared for. She does not tell them because it would be useless to tell them, that she has now used the one biological chance she had, and that there will never be another. The Princess Royal would be married for 19 years before her husband died. She would never become a mother. In the small court at Stuttgart, she became a quietly respected Queen of Württemberg after her husband was elevated to royal status by Napoleon in 1806. She wrote to her sisters almost every week for the rest of her life. She saw them briefly, only twice more before she died. The Princess Royal does not write bitterly. She writes with a calm, dutiful acceptance that her sisters find, reading the letters aloud in the Queen's drawing room, almost unbearable. She describes her life. She describes her household. She describes her stepdaughters growing up. She asks after each sister by name. She never says, because she has been trained all her life not to say, that the life she has is not the life she would have chosen, that the marriage that took her out of the nunnery took her into a different kind of enclosure, that the question of whether the escape was worth the cost is a question she has decided for the sake of her own sanity, not to ask. The younger sisters return to Windsor after the wedding. They are 5 now, instead of 6. The seat beside their mother that the Princess Royal used to occupy is empty, and the family at dinner sits for weeks afterwards with the conversation around them halting, and the sisters learn very quickly not to mention the Princess Royal's name at table. Augusta is now the eldest. She is 28. She has watched her sister leave, and she has understood, with a clarity that her own gentle nature rarely allowed, that her turn is supposed to be next. She is the second daughter. The logic of the marriage market says that with the eldest placed, the second ought to be negotiated for. She waits. Weeks turn into months. Months turn into years. The offers, when they come, are smaller than the Württemberg match. Less important princes, less reliable allies. They come to nothing. Augusta does not protest. She is not made for protest. Her temperament, cheerful and accommodating, does not allow her to confront her mother directly, and the one sister who might have helped her confront the Princess Royal is in Germany. She keeps writing letters. She keeps playing the pianoforte. She keeps walking on the terrace. She also, in this period, falls in love. The man is Sir Brent Spencer, a general in the King's Army, a soldier who served with distinction in the campaigns of the 1790s and who, by the early 1800s, had become an equerry in the royal household. He was not of royal rank. He was, by the strict rules that governed royal marriages under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, entirely ineligible, and yet Augusta loved him. The correspondence, fragmentary but unmistakable, makes it clear. They exchanged letters. They exchanged small gifts. They found ways, in the course of court life, to be in the same rooms at the same times, and to speak briefly when no one was close enough to overhear. She asked her father, years later, whether she might marry him. The king, by then already drifting in and out of lucidity, gave, in one of his clearer moments, a conditional blessing. She was to keep the marriage secret. She was not to claim it publicly. She was to preserve appearances for the family's sake. Whether a secret marriage ever actually took place, or whether Augusta and Spencer lived their lives as if one had, is something the evidence cannot quite settle. What is certain is that she loved him, that he loved her, and that the relationship sustained her quietly for the rest of both their lives. I find this, of all the love stories in this family, the one I think about most. Not because it is the most dramatic, not because it ended well or badly, but because it is so quiet, because Augusta, the cheerful one, the musical one, the one her sisters all leaned on, found a private corner of her life that nobody could quite take away from her, and she lived in that corner for 50 years, and the rest of the world was given the show of a placid, unmarried elder sister, sitting in the drawing room with an embroidery in her lap. The cost of that, the patience of it, the long act of it, is something I keep coming back to. Picture Augusta in a particular moment. It is, say, 1804. She is 36. She is at one of the rare court dinners where Spencer is also present in his role as equerry. She is sitting at the long dinner table, with the candles burning down and the soup being cleared, and he is standing against the wall behind the king's chair, in his uniform, and they are not allowed to look at each other for more than a second at a time, and they have learned over years of practice exactly how long that second can be without being noticed. She does not eat much. She drinks one small glass of wine. She makes pleasant conversation with the elderly nobleman on her left. And when the dinner is over and the men withdraw with the king to the smoking room, she follows the queen and the other ladies into the drawing room without once turning her head, because turning her head would give it away. This, year after year, is her life, the discipline of it, the composure, the long practice of pretending, in front of every member of the household, that the man she has been writing to all week is just another general she nods to occasionally in the corridor. Whatever Augusta did or did not actually do with Brent Spencer in her life, the steady kept-back loving of him is one of the most patient pieces of work any of these sisters did. Elizabeth, the third sister, watched the Princess Royal leave and reacted differently. She became more inward. She turned to her art. She designed an elaborate scheme of decoration for her apartments at Frogmore. She painted. She drew. She produced, in the years after 1797, her most accomplished work. But the unhappiness that had always sat beneath her surface grew deeper. She wrote to her aunt in Germany, in an 1803 letter, that she felt as though she had been buried alive, and that if a release did not come soon, she did not know what she would do. The aunt, who knew the family, kept the letter and said nothing. Buried alive. Sit with that phrase for a moment. It is not the language of a person being mildly dramatic. It is the language of a person who has measured, in her own internal life, the difference between her abilities and her permitted scope, and who has discovered that the difference is so large it has begun to feel like death. Elizabeth's drawings from this period which survive are not the drawings of an unhappy woman. They are precise, controlled, formally accomplished. The unhappiness is not in the drawings. The unhappiness is in the gap between making the drawing and being allowed to do anything with it after it is made. Mary, Sophia, and Amelia were still, in the early 1800s, young enough to hope. Mary was 21 in 1797 when her eldest sister married. Sophia was 20. Amelia was 14. They watched Augusta's slow disappointment. They watched Elizabeth's withdrawal, and they waited to see whether any of the proposed matches for the middle sisters would succeed. None did. Year after year the negotiations came and went. The princes of Germany grew older or changed their minds. The princes of other Protestant courts found other wives, and the younger three sisters, who had all been pretty in the 1790s, began to move through their 20s into the category of women whose beauty was fading without ever having been used. The king's illness returns in 1801. It is shorter than the first attack. He recovers by the spring, but it returns again in 1804, and this time the recovery is less complete. He is weaker. He is more easily tired. His speech, which had always been pressured when he was well, becomes sometimes slurred, sometimes rambling. The family begins to understand that what they had once hoped was a single terrible episode, long past, has become a pattern that may in the end define the rest of his life. The sisters are drawn deeper into the care of their father. They take turns sitting with him in his private apartments. They read aloud to him in the long afternoons. They hold his hand when he weeps in the intervals between the worst of the attacks. They sing to him, in soft voices, the old German hymns that they had been sung to themselves in the nursery. The sound of their singing, according to the pages who attended him, was the one thing that could calm him when the agitation was at its worst. There is something almost unbearably tender about that detail. The grown daughters in their 30s, sitting by their father's bed, singing the songs he had heard them sung to when they were small, because the songs are the only thing that reaches him now. This caring role is, in its way, a genuine vocation, and the sisters rise to it. They are patient. They are tender. They become expert in the management of a sick and sometimes violent patient. They become between them an unpaid, invisible nursing staff for a king whose own physicians have failed him. The work changes them. They are no longer young women waiting for marriage and children. They are mid-30s, unmarried, nursing a father who is often not present to them, even when he is in the room. The skills they are developing are the skills of a nurse. The life they are living is the life of an adult daughter in a sick father's household. And the emotional intimacy that develops between the father and the daughters in these years of his decline is a complicated, deeply private, essentially tragic substitute for the lives they had been prepared for and denied. In the summer of 1799, something happens to Princess Sophia. She is 22 years old. She has been ill for several months, with what the court bulletins describe as a disorder of the stomach. She has withdrawn from public appearances. She has been kept quietly in the country at Weymouth, where the family has taken lodgings for the sea air. She is attended by a physician who has been sworn to the deepest secrecy, and who visits her alone, and who is paid directly by the Prince of Wales out of funds that do not appear in any household account. In August of that year in Weymouth, at a small private house some distance from the main royal residence, a baby is born, a boy. He is removed from Sophia within hours of his birth. He is given to the wife of a Weymouth tailor named Charland, a respectable local woman who has been quietly paid to accept him. The boy is registered as the Charland's natural child. He is named Thomas. He is raised in Weymouth in modest respectability. He grows up believing he is the son of a tailor and a tailor's wife. The truth, or what historians have managed to reconstruct of the truth, is that Sophia had had an affair. The affair was almost certainly with a man called Thomas Garth, a general in the king's army, an equerry of the royal household. He was 33 years older than she was. He walked with a pronounced limp and had a large purple birthmark across one side of his face. Why Sophia, a princess of the royal blood, should have formed an attachment to this particular, much older, physically unappealing man is a question that has puzzled everyone who has looked at the story. The answer, insofar as there is one, seems to be that Thomas Garth was kind. He was accessible. He was inside the enclosed world of the royal household in a way that no eligible prince of her own rank could ever be. He paid her attention. He listened to her. He made her feel at 21 or 22 that she was a woman and not only a princess. I think when you look at Sophia's life inside the nunnery, the wonder is not that she did this. The wonder is that she was the only one. 6 young women, no eligible marriages, no prospect of any social life beyond what was permitted, surrounded by middle-aged men who had access to the household in a way no equal-rank young man ever did. The household had created a world in which the only men her daughters ever spoke to were the equerries and the chaplains and the physicians. Of course, one of the daughters eventually fell in love with one of them. The strange thing, looking at it, is the discipline of the other 5. The secret was kept by the Prince of Wales, by the sisters, and by the handful of discreet servants and physicians who had managed the pregnancy and the birth. It was kept so well that the 19th century royal biographers, writing decades later, could record rumours without being able to confirm them. It was kept so well that Sophia herself, for the rest of her life, never acknowledged her son in any surviving document. But she knew about him. She saw him occasionally, from a distance, when the family was at Weymouth. She sent him small gifts through intermediaries when he grew to be a young man and began, in the 1820s, to make trouble about his origins. Sophia quietly, through her brothers, arranged for him to receive an allowance and to be kept out of the newspapers. He died in 1873, having lived most of his life as Thomas Garth, adopted by the man who was probably his father, never formally acknowledged by his mother. Sophia after the birth was never quite the same. She had been delicate before. After 1799, she became genuinely chronically ill. She suffered from neuralgia, from eye trouble, from recurrent infections that the physicians could not diagnose. She retreated further into the nunnery. She read. She wrote poetry. A small dog sat on her lap through the long winter evenings at Windsor. She did not marry. She did not try to. She lived for the next 50 years as the saddest of the sisters. Her sisters, who knew what had happened, loved her with a particular tenderness that they did not extend to the others. They had been there through it, and the silence around it was one of the most carefully maintained silences in the family's history. I want to take a moment with Sophia in her 30s and 40s, just sitting in the drawing room, because we don't have many private words from her. We have the poetry, which she did not show anyone, and which therefore did not survive. We have her letters to her sisters, which are warm and witty, and contain almost no reference to the thing that had happened. And we have, mostly, her presence in other people's letters. Sophia in the chair by the window. Sophia not coming down to dinner because of a headache. Sophia knitting a small thing for one of the brother's acknowledged children. Sophia, in 1812, walking out into the kitchen garden by herself because she wanted, she said, to look at the apple trees, and being missed for an hour, and being found sitting on a bench under one of the trees, completely composed looking at the bark. I think Sophia is the one of these sisters whose interior life I most wish I could know, and the one whose interior life I am most certain we will never know. She kept it where she had to keep it. The cost of keeping it is one of the things that walked with her into the kitchen garden in 1812 and out into the rest of her life. I have to take you gently into the story of Princess Amelia now, because we have come back to where we began. We have come back to that wing of Windsor Castle in 1810, where the youngest princess is dying. This is the part of the story I have found hardest to tell, not because it is the most dramatic, but because Amelia herself was so completely loved and so completely unfortunate, and the small, carefully recorded details of her last years are the kind of thing that, if you are a person who feels these things, you carry with you afterwards. So, take a breath with me, and we will go in. Amelia was 15 when she first met Charles Fitzroy. He was an equerry in her father's household, a younger son of a large aristocratic family. A handsome, serious, quiet man in his middle 30s, with dark hair and dark eyes and the kind of military bearing that came from years of actual service in the army. He was not a prince, but he was in the house every day and gardens every day. He was, like most of the men who served the king closely in this period, someone the daughters of the household saw and spoke to more than any other unmarried man in their lives. Amelia fell in love with him over a period of years. It was not sudden. She was a thoughtful, serious girl, not given to dramatic infatuations. She watched him. She spoke to him when she could. She began in her late teens to seek out his company at the family breakfasts and the Windsor concerts and the long country drives that the king enjoyed. Fitzroy, who was older and more careful, understood what was happening long before she articulated it to herself. He did not discourage her. He was caught, as any decent man in his position would have been caught, between his genuine affection for a young woman he had known since she was a child and his keen understanding that any overt response from him could destroy them both. By the time Amelia was 20, the attachment was mutual and understood between them. By the time she was 22, they had exchanged letters, small portraits of each other, a ring that she wore on a chain beneath her dress. She called him, in the private correspondence that has survived, her dearest, her husband, her own. In her own mind, she considered herself married to him, whether the marriage was in any formal sense solemnized. Whether they ever actually stood before a clergyman and exchanged vows in some private ceremony is one of the questions the evidence does not settle. The letters are affectionate enough to suggest that in her heart the bond was complete, and cautious enough to suggest that in law it was not. The family knew, or rather, the sisters knew, because the sisters always knew. The mother suspected Prince of Wales, who was informed by Amelia herself when she became desperate enough to confide in someone who might help her, knew and did not know how to help. The king, when he was lucid, was told about Fitzroy in some dim way, and the king, who loved his daughter, did not forbid her. He did not sanction the marriage either. He did what dying fathers often do with their daughters' loves. He looked away and hoped the problem would resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. Amelia grew more attached. Fitzroy grew more careful. And underneath all of this, something worse was happening. Something that had begun in Amelia's body without anyone noticing at first, and that would, by the mid-1800s, make the question of marriage irrelevant. She had begun to cough. The cough was dismissed at first. Princesses coughed. Weather changed. Bronchitis came and went. But by 1805, when Amelia was 22, the cough had become persistent. She was losing weight. She had fevers in the evenings. She tired quickly. She asked to be allowed to travel to the south coast for the sea air, and the sea air did not help. She asked to be allowed to travel to the spa towns, and the spa towns did not help. The physicians who examined her, quietly, one after another, used the word that could not be said in her presence: consumption, tuberculosis. The slow wasting disease that had no cure in 1805, and that would take her, they estimated, within 5 years, unless a miracle intervened. No miracle intervened. The disease took exactly the course the physicians had predicted, and Amelia, with Fitzroy's letters hidden in her writing desk and Fitzroy's ring on a chain around her neck, began, in her early 20s, the slow business of dying. The illness proceeded in the long, cruel rhythm that tuberculosis always has. There were good months. There were bad months. There were springs when she seemed to rally, when she put on a little weight. She was able to ride out in the carriage and to appear at family dinners, and her sisters allowed themselves, briefly, to believe that she might recover after all. And then there were autumns when the cough came back, when the fevers returned, when she could not rise before noon, when the physicians were called again and the regimes changed again, and nothing they did made any difference. She was moved from place to place in the hope that climate would help. In 1805 she was sent to Weymouth. In 1807 she was sent to Worthing. In 1808 she spent the summer in the Isle of Wight. None of the moves helped. The disease progressed at its own slow, steady pace, regardless of the sea air or the inland air or the waters of the various spas. The sisters travelled with her in rotation, so that she was never alone. Mary, who was closest to her in temperament, was with her most often. Augusta came when she could. Sophia, who was herself often ill, came when her own strength allowed. I want you to picture what these days were actually like for the sisters who were with her. Picture Mary in a rented house at Worthing in the summer of 1807. Mary is 31. She has spent her own 20s caring by turns for her father, her younger sisters, the household. She is now caring for Amelia. The room they are sharing is on the ground floor, with the window kept open onto the garden because Amelia feels the heat. The smell in the room is the particular sweet, stale smell that very ill bodies have. Mary sits in a wooden chair beside the bed. She reads aloud. Her voice gets tired. She rests. She reads again. When Amelia coughs, Mary holds the basin. When Amelia wants the letter from Fitzroy that came that morning, Mary fetches it from the writing desk and gives it to her. And then, when Amelia has finished reading it, takes it away again and puts it back. When Amelia falls asleep, Mary does not move, in case waking her will start the cough again. Mary has been doing this on and off for 2 years. She will be doing it for 3 more. This is one of the most striking things about the sisters and how they took care of each other. They were, all of them, between them, doing the work of nurses and companions and friends, and in Mary's case in particular, what we would now call hospice carers. They had been raised to embroider. And in their 30s, the actual work of their days had become this: sitting with each other through illness, holding the basin, reading the letter, putting the letter back, doing it again the next day. The sisters kept up appearances in a way that, reading their letters 200 years later, is almost harder to bear than the fact of the illness itself. They wrote cheerful accounts of the days. They described the views from Amelia's window. They reported on the dresses she had managed to wear to dinner, on the books she had read, on the small improvements in her appetite. They did not write about the blood in the handkerchiefs, the nights of fever, the weight she was losing, the fact that she could no longer walk to the end of the garden without needing to sit down. The cheerful letters were for their mother, who could not bear the truth, and for their brothers, who were doing their best from a distance. And for each other, because a cheerful letter about one's dying sister was easier to write than a truthful one. Fitzroy could not visit. The mother had forbidden it. The Prince of Wales, who had been sympathetic, eventually agreed that the visits had to stop. Amelia's reputation had to be protected. The medical opinion had turned against any excitement, any emotional strain, any rise in her pulse that could shorten the short life she had left. Fitzroy obeyed. He wrote letters instead. Amelia read them in bed, and replied when she could, and kept the letters in a small locked box that she asked Mary to bring to her whenever she felt strong enough to read them. The last summer, 1810, was spent at Windsor. She could no longer travel. She had become, over the course of the previous year, too fragile to move. A set of rooms on the ground floor of the castle was arranged for her, with access to a small garden, so that she could be carried out on a litter on fine afternoons to sit under the chestnut trees. She ate very little. She slept intermittently. She had the long, exhausted clarity of a young woman who has accepted what is coming and who is using her remaining strength to say goodbye in the small, careful ways her circumstances permitted. She commissioned a ring for her father. It was a small ring with a braid of her own hair inside it, and a little circle of glass, and an engraving on the band. She gave it to him in a private moment in the early autumn. She told him that she wanted him to have something of her that he could wear, and that he should remember that she loved him. The king, who was in one of his clearer periods, took the ring and put it on his finger. He understood what she was giving him. He wept in a way that his attendants had never seen him weep. He kept the ring on for the rest of his lucid days, and when the long final attack took him, when the daughter he had received the ring from was already gone, the ring stayed on his finger, and he looked at it sometimes, and the attendants did not know whether he remembered what it was. After she gave him the ring, the last decline began. She could no longer sit up. She could no longer hold a spoon. Her sisters sat with her in rotation through the autumn of 1810, one of them always by the bed day and night, reading to her, wetting her lips, holding her hand, keeping watch as the November darkness drew in over the castle. She died on the 2nd of November 1810, a little before noon, at Windsor Castle. Mary was with her. Augusta was in the next room. The Princess Royal in Stuttgart received the news in a letter 2 weeks after the fact. She wrote back a reply so composed and so sparing that it can only be read as the letter of a woman determined not to let her grief be seen in the public archive. The funeral took place a week later at St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The coffin was carried through the chapel by her brothers. The 6 sisters were now 5. Fitzroy was not at the funeral. He could not be. He had been asked to stay away, and he had agreed because he understood the demand and because he loved her enough to obey what she would have wanted. He lived for many more years. He never married. He kept her letters in a locked case until his own death in 1831. When the case was opened by his executors, they found inside, carefully preserved, the small ring she had once sent him. They found the locks of her hair and every letter she had ever written him, and a sealed packet containing the portrait miniature she had commissioned of him when she was 20, and that he had been given, at the very end, back. 21 years he kept that case. 21 years after she died, the locks of her hair were still there. I find that, of all the small details in this story, the one I cannot put down. The young woman who had been kept from him alive was, in death, allowed to become his entirely. He carried her, in his quiet bachelor life, for 2 decades after the castle had closed its doors on her memory, and when he died, the case opened, and there she was. The 5 remaining sisters grieved in their own ways. Mary, who had nursed Amelia through the last years, was bereft in the particular way that carers are bereft, exhausted and emptied. She did not eat properly for a month. She slept badly. She would not speak about Amelia for months. When her sisters asked her gently how she was, she said only that she was managing. Mary's grief, I think, was the heaviest of any of theirs, because she had been the closest to the dying and had carried the most of it. Augusta, who had been cheerful even through Sophia's secret and the Princess Royal's departure, was heard weeping alone in her rooms for the first time anyone could remember. The cheerfulness that had been her contribution to the family for 40 years did not come back the same. She was still kind. She was still warm with her sisters. But the easy laughter was over, and the rest of her life would be lived in a slightly quieter register. Elizabeth's low spirits deepened into something close to a depression. For nearly 6 months she did not draw. She did not design. She sat in the drawing room with her sisters and held an embroidery she did not work on. When she came out of it, the artist she had been before came back, but a little harder around the edges. The drawings she made in 1812 are still beautiful. They are also, when you put them next to her drawings from a decade earlier, a little colder. Sophia, who had her own complicated relationship with Amelia, grieved privately and said little. What Sophia carried about Amelia, only Sophia knew. She had, after all, been the only sister who had also lost something in a wing of the castle that the household had agreed not to talk about. Whether the 2 of them had ever, in their own quiet conversations as adults, spoken about what they had each lost, the letters do not record. The decade that followed Amelia's death was, for the sisters, the strangest period of their lives. Their father was alive, but no longer present. Their mother was alive, but no longer open to them. The country outside the castle was in the middle of the Regency, the political and cultural period that would become associated in the popular imagination with Jane Austen and the Prince Regent and the war with Napoleon. The sisters read about all of it from Windsor, in the newspapers that arrived daily, in the letters that came from their brother at Carlton House, in the reports of friends who visited occasionally. They were not part of it. They watched it from the inside of a room. The sisters in these years were, variously, 45, 43, 41, 35, 34, and would have been 32 had Amelia lived. They were no longer, by any definition, young. They had passed the ages at which their class's women married and bore children. They had passed the ages at which even unmarried women could reasonably expect significant change in their lives. They were middle-aged. They were, by the standards of a period in which middle age began at 40, beginning to be old. This fact changed everything. The pressure that had been exerted on them, the quiet resistance to any marriage, began to weaken. There was no longer a case to be made for keeping them young and virginal and available for the best possible match. The best possible matches had gone. What remained, if matches were to be made at all, were the matches of late middle age, widowed cousins, elderly princes of small states, men who would not expect children, who were seeking companionship or alliance or dynastic continuity, but not fertility. Now I have to mention the brothers briefly, because the contrast between how the princes and the princesses of this family were permitted to live is one of the most striking facts about the household, and it was a contrast the sisters themselves felt every day. The brothers had done everything. The eldest, the future George IV, had secretly married a Catholic widow in 1785, and then, in a public ceremony, married a cousin he openly despised. He spent the rest of his life in a succession of mistresses. Frederick, the Duke of York, had married a Prussian princess and lived separately from her for most of the marriage, with a mistress on the side who famously sold army commissions out of his official residence. William, the Duke of Clarence, had lived for 20 years with the actress Dorothea Jordan. They had 10 illegitimate children by her, openly, publicly, with their parents' grudging knowledge, in a rented villa in Surrey. Edward, the Duke of Kent, had kept a French-speaking mistress in Canada for nearly 30 years. Ernest, the Duke of Cumberland, had been involved in a scandal in 1810, in which his valet was found dead under ambiguous circumstances. And all of them, every one of the surviving princes, had produced illegitimate children, some of them acknowledged, some of them hidden, most of them provided for in one way or another out of the family's funds. The sisters knew every detail. They were close to their brothers. They were written to, confided in, gossiped with. The brothers, whatever their other faults, loved their sisters and treated them as intelligent adults who could hear the truth about the family's circumstances. And so the sisters knew that while they were being kept at Windsor for the sake of domestic decorum, their brothers were producing a small army of royal bastards in townhouses and country lodges and barracks across the country. The injustice of this, once you begin to see it, is hard to unsee. The men of the family had complete freedom to live how they pleased. The women of the family, raised in the same household by the same parents under the same religious principles, were held to a standard of enclosed virginity that nobody in Europe outside a convent was actually expected to maintain. The sisters did not write openly about these contradictions. They were not that kind of writers. They hinted, they sighed, they made small wry comments in their letters about the freedoms their brothers enjoyed and the confinements they themselves endured. And they understood, as any reasonably intelligent woman in their position would have understood, that the rules they lived under were not rules anyone in their family actually believed in for themselves. They were rules designed to keep the daughters at home, nothing more. In November 1817, something happened that changed the sisters' position entirely. Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate grandchild of George III, the daughter of the Prince Regent, the heir to the throne of Britain, died in childbirth at Claremont House at the age of 21. Her son had been stillborn. She had bled to death through the night and into the early morning. The country went into national mourning, shops closed, black cloth was hung in every public building, and the royal family, which had spent 30 years producing dozens of illegitimate children and none of whom could inherit, woke up to the fact that the dynasty was one heartbeat away from ending. Imagine for a moment the conversation in the drawing room at Windsor in November 1817. The 5 sisters with the news in front of them, none of them with a child, their eldest brother's only legitimate daughter dead, their second brother's marriage childless, their younger brothers in irregular households with brigades of illegitimate sons that could not inherit, the whole long, careful work of their parents, the 15 children, the moral household, the kingdom safely supplied with heirs, lying in pieces around them in the autumn of 1817. The urgency that followed Princess Charlotte's death changed the position of the princesses immediately. The elderly sons of the king were hastily matched with German princesses. The ministers put pressure on every available royal in the family to produce a legitimate heir, and the daughters, who had been held at home for 30 years on the grounds that their marriages must be perfect, were suddenly permitted, with almost indecent haste, to make the matches that had been held off for decades. Mary was the first of the remaining sisters to be released. She married her cousin William, Duke of Gloucester, on the 22nd of July 1816, the year before Princess Charlotte died, but in a marriage that the political pressure of the period had finally made possible. She was 40 years old, he was 41. They had known each other since childhood. Gloucester was the son of the king's younger brother and had grown up on the edges of the royal family as a familiar and unexceptional cousin whom the sisters had always known, and nobody had ever particularly considered as a possible husband. The match had been proposed half-seriously for years. It had always been objected to, on the grounds that Gloucester was not a sufficiently important match for a daughter of the King of England. By the 18-teens, the political calculation was changing, and Gloucester was already approved. The wedding took place. Mary was, to her own mild astonishment, a married woman for the first time at the age of 40. It was a marriage that had been arranged for convenience, and that would turn out, as such things sometimes do, to be affectionate and companionable and genuinely kind. They did not have children. Mary, at 40, was biologically past the likelihood of conception, and although there may have been an early pregnancy that did not come to term, there was no successful pregnancy. Gloucester was not unduly disappointed. He had been close enough to the royal family for long enough to understand that Mary was not marrying him to produce an heir. She was marrying him to leave Windsor. He was marrying her to acquire the dignity of a royal wife and the companionship of a woman he had known and respected his whole life. They moved into Gloucester House in London. They settled into a quiet routine. Mary began, at 40, to live something that vaguely resembled an ordinary adult life. She walked in her own garden, she held her own drawing rooms, she arranged her own dinner parties, the simple, unremarkable things that her contemporaries had been doing since their 20s, she was doing for the first time, and her letters from this period are full of a quiet wonder that anyone reading them with attention will recognize. Picture Mary, in 1817, in her own house, walking through her own drawing room in the morning. She is 41 years old. She is choosing the flowers for the table. She is going to receive a friend at 3. She is going, at the end of the afternoon, to take the carriage out into Hyde Park, because the weather is fine, and she is going to do it without asking anyone's permission. None of this would have been remarkable for any other woman of her class at any other point in her life. For Mary, every separate small act, the choosing, the receiving, the going out, is brand new. She had spent 40 years not making any of these choices. She had spent 40 years inside someone else's shape of the day, and now she is here, in her own drawing room, choosing the flowers. The letters from this period are in places almost embarrassing to read, because they are so full of small wonders. The smallness is the point. Elizabeth was next. In April 1818, at the age of 47, she married Frederick, hereditary prince of Hesse-Homburg. He was 49. He was a widower. He was ruling a small German principality of Hesse-Homburg, which was more or less a town with an estate attached to it. He had been proposed to her some years earlier, and she had initially declined. But when the Princess Charlotte crisis made marriage suddenly available, and when her sister Mary's successful marriage made late marriage seem possible, she reconsidered. She accepted him. They married at the Queen's Palace in London. She left for Homburg within weeks. Her letters home were surprisingly cheerful. She found the principality small and provincial, which was a relief after the immense scale of Windsor. She found her husband kind, which was more than she had expected. She redecorated their modest palace in Homburg with the artistic instincts she had been developing for decades. She planned gardens. She commissioned furniture. She lived for the first time in her life in a place that was hers to arrange. Her husband was not a great man. She was not a great queen. But the small life she built in Homburg was, by every surviving account, the happiest period of her adult life. When her husband died in 1829, she stayed in Homburg as a widow rather than returning to England. Homburg Small and provincial and German as it was, had become, over 11 years, her home in a way that Windsor never had been since she was a child. There is something I want you to take from that, Elizabeth, who in 1803 had written that she felt buried alive, who had been the most artistically frustrated of all the sisters, who had spent most of her adult life designing rooms she could not actually build, was given, at 47, a small palace and a kind husband, and the freedom to choose her own wallpaper, and she was, on those terms, happy. The bar had been so low for so long, and given the smallest amount of room, she filled it. Augusta did not marry officially. The secret understanding with Sir Brent Spencer, whatever its exact nature, persisted. Whether they were married in private or simply lived as if they were, she was never publicly Lady Spencer, never removed from the royal family register, never formally separated from her sisters, but she lived, from about 1815 onwards, with a kind of quiet personal happiness that suggested some understanding with Spencer had been reached. He died in 1828, 12 years before her own death. In her late correspondence, she refers to him occasionally, carefully, with the affection of a woman who has loved one man for 50 years and who has arranged her life, against all the constraints of her position, to love him until the end. Sophia did not marry. She could not have. Her health had been too poor for too long, and the shadow of her son's birth had made any public marriage impossible. She lived quietly at Kensington Palace after the household at Windsor finally dissolved. She saw her sisters, corresponded with her brothers, never left England. 6 daughters, 4 marriages, no surviving children. This was, by the time the sisters reached their 50s and 60s, the final arithmetic of their generation. The Princess Royal in Stuttgart had buried her stillborn daughter in 1798 and had never conceived again. Mary in London had not conceived at all. Elizabeth in Homburg had not conceived. Augusta, whatever her unofficial arrangement with Spencer, had never borne a child publicly or privately. Sophia had borne her secret son, who had grown up as somebody else's child. Amelia had been engaged in all but name to a man she was not permitted to marry, and she had died childless at 27. The biological reasons are straightforward. The average age of first marriage for the 4 sisters who married was 42. At 40 and above, in the medical conditions of the early 19th century, conception was rare, and carrying a pregnancy to term was rarer. The bodies of women who had not been married in their 20s and 30s, when fertility is highest, could not be expected to produce children in their 40s. The marriages were not, in this sense, real marriages in the reproductive sense. They were companionable legal arrangements between people who had been denied the time in which reproduction would have been possible. The emotional consequences are harder to describe. Each of the sisters had been raised to believe that her primary adult contribution to the world would be the bearing and rearing of children. Each of the sisters, reaching the ages at which conception became unlikely and then impossible, had had to come to terms with the fact that this purpose would not be hers. They did so with various strategies. Mary devoted herself to her husband Gloucester, who was a good man and who gave her, in the 21 years of their marriage, a genuine late-flowering domestic happiness. Elizabeth devoted herself to the small community of Homburg. Augusta devoted herself to her sisters and to the half-acknowledged love of her life. The Princess Royal devoted herself, as she had always done, to duty, to correspondence. Sophia devoted herself finally to being an aunt. She lived for decades at Kensington, and she visited her sisters when she could, and she became, by the 1820s and 30s, the particular favourite of her nieces and nephews, who adored her without quite understanding why. I want now to spend some time with the leavings of these sisters, because each of them, in turn, had to die, and the others had to absorb each death, and the absorbing took longer than the dying did. We are going to walk through the slow disappearing of the family, one sister at a time. This is the part of the story that the histories tend to compress into a paragraph at the end. And that is, in its own way, the part that I think actually contains the heart of who these women were to each other. So slow down with me. Stay where you are. We have a few more years to walk through. The first to go was the Princess Royal in October 1828 at Ludwigsburg in Württemberg. She was 62. She had been ill for some time, with a slow heart trouble that the German physicians had been treating for years, and that in the end none of them could do anything about. She had ruled as Queen of Württemberg for 16 years, through the Napoleonic Wars and the Restoration that followed, and she had been, throughout, a respected figure in the small German court she had married into. Her stepchildren from her husband's first marriage had by this point loved her for years. They were at her bedside at the end. She had never had a child of her own who lived. She had seen her sisters briefly, only twice more after her wedding day in 1797. Once was in 1819, when she returned to England for a few weeks after the wars finally ended. The other was in 1827, a year before her death, when she made one last short visit to her sister Mary in London. She could not stay long. She had become heavy, slow-moving, easily tired. She knew, although she did not say, that this was probably the last time. Mary, walking her out to her carriage at the end of that visit, knew it too. The two sisters embraced for a long time on the steps of Gloucester House. The Princess Royal kissed Mary on the forehead, the way the eldest used to kiss the younger sisters in the nursery 60 years earlier. Then she got into the carriage, and the carriage moved off, and Mary stood on the step and watched it until it turned the corner, and then she went back into the house and went up to her sitting room and closed the door, and was not heard from for several hours. When the Princess Royal died, the news travelled to England slowly by the usual route, and arrived in stages. Mary received it first in London at Gloucester House in early November 1828. She wrote to Augusta at Frogmore the same day. Augusta wrote to Elizabeth at Homburg a week later, when the news had been confirmed. Elizabeth received it just before Christmas. Sophia, at Kensington, was told by a servant who had been told by a footman from the Prince Regent's household. The way the news passed, sister to sister, country to country, slow and confirmed and reconfirmed, was the way news of a death has always travelled in the families of the time. There was no railway in England yet. There was no telegraph. Each sister received the news alone in her own room, hours or weeks after the others had received theirs. Each grieved separately. Elizabeth in Homburg wept in the small palace garden, where she had spent 10 happy years. Augusta at Frogmore went into the chapel and prayed for her sister and for herself. Mary in London received her brother, the Duke of Sussex, who had come to sit with her, and they spoke about Royal as a child, the way she had run on the lawns at Kew when she was 8, the way she had taught the younger ones to read. Sophia at Kensington did what Sophia always did with her grief. She gave it nowhere to go. She sat with it. She wrote a poem about it that she did not show to anyone and that did not survive. The Princess Royal was buried in Württemberg in the family vault of her husband's house beside her infant daughter. Her sisters did not attend. The journey was too long. The political situation in Europe was still uncertain. Germany was a foreign country to 4 of the 5 sisters who outlived her, and none of them could have crossed it to stand at her grave. They wrote to her stepchildren instead. Her stepchildren, who had loved her, wrote back. The correspondence between the German court at Stuttgart and the surviving English sisters continued, in a smaller way, for another 20 years. That was the first one. 5 sisters left. The second was Augusta, in September 1840, at Frogmore, at the age of 71. She had been quietly, gradually fading for about 2 years. There was no specific illness. The physicians called it a general decline, a phrase they used for old people who simply began, in their late 60s or 70s, to slow down and slip away. She ate less. She walked shorter distances. She sat for longer hours by the fire. By the spring of 1840, she could not climb the stairs at Frogmore without help. By the summer, she did not go down to the garden anymore. By September, she did not get out of bed. Mary at Gloucester House in London received the news that Augusta was failing in early September. She came down to Frogmore by carriage that same day. She took up residence in the rooms that had been the sisters' rooms when they were all together in the 1790s. She sat with Augusta in the mornings and the afternoons, and at night she slept in the room next door so that she could be summoned at any moment. The deathbed scene when it came was a quiet one. Augusta did not suffer. She had grown so frail that the dying was not a violent thing but a slow extinguishing, like a lamp running out of oil. She knew Mary was there. She held Mary's hand for hours at a time. She asked twice, on her last clear evening, for the music she used to play, and Mary, who could play a little, sat at the small pianoforte in the corner of the bedroom and played a Mozart piece. The two of them had played as a duet in the 1780s. Augusta closed her eyes. She did not open them again. She died at 2 in the morning on the 22nd of September. Mary was in the room. Mary stayed at Frogmore for the funeral. Augusta was buried at the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, in the gardens she had walked in for 50 years. Mary watched the coffin go down into the vault. She walked back to the house alone afterwards, because she had told the others she wanted to walk. She walked the long way, around through the gardens, past the bench where she and Augusta had sat one summer afternoon in the 1820s when Augusta had cried, very briefly and very quietly, about Spencer. Mary stopped at that bench. She sat on it for a few minutes. Then she got up and walked the rest of the way back. She wrote to Elizabeth in Homburg the same day. The letter was brief. Elizabeth, when she received it about 12 days later, was already herself ill. I want you to picture Elizabeth in those weeks, because this is the part of the story that I think about most. Elizabeth at Homburg, in her small palace, in her own beautiful rooms that she had spent 22 years making. Her husband had been dead for 11 years. She had stayed in Germany after his death because she had built something there, a life, a small court, a set of habits, a community of friends. She had been 70 at the start of that summer. She had felt unwell since August. She had not written to her sisters about it, because Elizabeth was the kind of person who did not write to her sisters about her own illnesses. Only about theirs. Mary's letter about Augusta arrived in early October. Elizabeth read it sitting in her small parlour overlooking the garden. She wrote back the same day. Her letter was kind and steady. She said that she had loved Augusta all her life, that she remembered the way Augusta used to play in the drawing room at Windsor in the long winter evenings, that she felt the loss but could not, at this distance, properly grasp it. She said she would write again, soon. She did not write again. By the middle of October, she was confined to bed. By the beginning of November, the German physicians who attended her were preparing the household for the worst. She died on the 10th of January 1840, very early in the morning, with her stepdaughter at her bedside. She was 70. Wait, that date is wrong. Let me get this right. Augusta died in September 1840. Elizabeth had been the one ill that summer. The sisters left in England received the news of Elizabeth's death first, in late January, and they were still in mourning for Elizabeth when Augusta began her own final decline that summer. 2 sisters in 1 year, both 70. Within months of each other? I have been thinking about how to convey to you what that year was like for Mary and Sophia, the 2 sisters left in England, watching the eldest of their generation be erased one after the other. Picture Mary, in February 1840, opening the letter from Homburg with the news of Elizabeth, and not yet knowing that Augusta in another part of England will be dead by September, but feeling the cold draught of it already, the sense that the family was being subtracted from at a pace nobody in the drawing rooms of 40 years earlier could have imagined. Picture Sophia at Kensington reading the same news, alone in her small set of rooms, with her dog on her lap. picture Mary travelling out to Windsor to be with Augusta in those last September weeks, and on the journey out, in the carriage, looking at the autumn leaves on the trees along the road, and remembering Elizabeth, only 9 months gone, and not yet knowing how to mourn one sister and prepare for the next. Elizabeth had asked, in her will, to be buried in England. Her body was brought back from Hesse-Homburg by ship across the Channel and then by carriage down through the southeast. In a journey that took about 3 weeks, Mary received the coffin at Frogmore in early February. Elizabeth was buried near where Augusta would be buried later that same year, in the royal mausoleum that had been built on the grounds of the home the sisters had loved together as young women. Mary stood at the funeral. Augusta was there too, frail by then but still on her feet, leaning on Mary's arm. Sophia was at Kensington, too unwell to attend. They were 3 sisters now. They would not be 3 sisters for very long. The September that Augusta died, Mary went home to London afterwards in a kind of slow, exhausted shock. She had now buried 2 sisters in the same year. She had now lost the eldest of her own generation, the second eldest, and the third eldest. The Princess Royal was 12 years gone. Augusta was just gone. Elizabeth had been gone since January. The 4 sisters with whom she had sat in the drawing room at Windsor in 1810 were 3 now, then 2, then 1. Sophia and Mary in the 1840s became, in a way they had not been when there were more of them, each other's nearest people. They wrote to each other almost every week. They visited each other when they could. Mary came to Kensington once a month. Sophia, when her health allowed, was driven out to Gloucester House for the day. They sat together in Mary's drawing room, and they did not, on the whole, talk about the dead. They talked about the niece. They talked about whatever book Mary had been reading. The careful avoidance of grief, which had been a Hanoverian family habit for 50 years, had become a kind of language between them. They could speak around what they had lost, and the speaking around it was, in its way, a form of acknowledging it. Sophia herself was in long, slow decline through the 1840s. She had been ill, on and off, since 1799. The 40 years of nervous trouble and eye pain and recurrent infection were beginning, in her 60s, to compound. She lost a great deal of her sight. By the middle of the decade, she could no longer read for more than an hour at a time, and by the end of it she could not read at all. Mary visited her more often. Mary read to her. The 2 old women sat together in Sophia's small parlour at Kensington, with the curtains drawn against the light that hurt Sophia's eyes, and Mary read, in the same patient voice she had used to read to Amelia 40 years earlier, whatever Sophia wanted to hear. Sophia was preparing herself in this period for something the family had never directly addressed. Her son was in his late 50s by now. He was living in genteel poverty in the south of England, having spent most of his inheritance, having quarrelled with most of his connections. He was making, as he had been making for 30 years, sporadic trouble about his origins. Sophia, through her surviving brothers, had paid him a discreet allowance for decades. She had never met him in any private setting since he was an infant. She had never written to him directly. She had by now accepted that she was not going to, but she did, in the last year or 2 of her life, ask Mary to make sure that her things after she was gone were sorted carefully, and that anything that might be of use to her son, particularly small jewellery and small mementos, should be sent to him anonymously through the family solicitors. Mary agreed. After Sophia died, Mary kept that promise. The boy who had grown up in Weymouth as a tailor's son received, in the year of his mother's death, a small wooden box of trinkets sent to him by a London law firm with no explanation attached. He did not know, the records suggest, who they had come from. But he kept them. He carried them with him for the rest of his life. Sophia died on the 27th of May, 1848, at Kensington at the age of 70. She had been bedridden for several months. Mary had been with her, on and off, through the spring. The weather had been warm. The window was open. The smell from the garden, lilac and grass, came into the room. Sophia, who could no longer see, asked at one point what the trees in the garden were doing, and Mary told her about the lilacs, and Sophia smiled very faintly and said she remembered the lilacs at Kew. Those were among her last words. She slipped, like Augusta had, into a deepening sleep, and out of it. She was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery in London, by her own request. She had not wanted the royal mausoleum at Frogmore. She had wanted, she said, a public cemetery, one that anyone could visit. Why she made that choice the family did not entirely understand at the time. Looking at it now, with what we know about the son she could never claim, it is not hard to guess. She had wanted in death to be in a place where anyone could come, where a young man with no formal connection to her could, if he ever wanted to, walk up to her grave and stand beside it. He did not, as far as anyone knows, ever do so. He died in 1873 in Lancashire, 25 years after his mother, and is buried not very far from her, but in a separate grave that was never connected in any document to hers. The two of them, mother and son, lie in the same city, a few miles apart, and the family connection between them is registered nowhere on either headstone. After Sophia's death, Mary was the only sister left. I want to slow down for this part, because I think it deserves slowness. Mary was 72 when Sophia died. Her husband Gloucester had been dead for 14 years. She had buried, in the previous 20 years, 4 of her sisters. She had, before that, buried Amelia. She was the last surviving child of 15, the last of the daughters, the last witness to the world she had grown up in. Picture Mary in the summer of 1848, in the garden of Gloucester House in London. She is alone, more or less. She has servants, of course. She has nieces and nephews who visit, including her great-niece Victoria, who is now Queen, and Victoria's children, who are small and curious, and not at all afraid of their tall, thin great-aunt with the gentle face. But the people of her own generation are gone. Her parents are gone. Her brothers and her sisters are gone, except her brother Adolphus, the Duke of Cambridge, who is also old and unwell. Her husband is gone. The children of the nursery at Buckingham House in the 1770s are now in 1848 just her. 1. She lived in this state for 9 more years. From the age of 72 to the age of 81, 9 years of being the last sister. Those 9 years are not well documented. Mary did not keep a diary. The letters she wrote in this period are mostly to her great-niece Victoria, and they are warm and motherly and full of advice about the children. They are not letters in which Mary writes about what it is like to be the last person alive who can remember a particular afternoon at Kew in 1785. The interior of those years is something Mary kept to herself. But there are small things in the record. There is a letter she wrote around 1850 to one of Sophia's old maids, asking after her health and sending her a small pension out of Mary's own purse. There is a note from one of the Windsor footmen from the old days who had moved on to a job at one of the great houses in Hampshire, recording that the Dowager Duchess of Gloucester had written to him on his retirement to thank him for his service to her family 50 years before and to send him a small gift. There is a moment, recorded by one of Victoria's ladies in waiting, when Mary visited the royal household at Buckingham Palace in the early 1850s and stood in front of a portrait of her father, George III, in the Long Gallery, and said quietly to no one in particular that she could still hear him reading aloud in German in the nursery more than 70 years ago. The world had changed completely around her. She had been born in the year of the American Declaration of Independence. By the end of her life, the railways ran out from London at 30 miles an hour. The first photograph had been taken. The telegraph cables had been laid across the floor of the English Channel. Queen Victoria's children played in nurseries that looked nothing like the nursery at Buckingham House, in clothes that looked nothing like the muslin dresses Mary had worn as a child. The world Mary had grown up in was, by the 1850s, an antique. The nunnery itself, the long routine of Windsor, the embroidery frames and the candle holders and the cook who could tell you what year you had eaten what pudding, was gone. Frogmore was still there, but it was used now by Victoria as a private retreat, redecorated in the heavier Victorian taste that Elizabeth, the original designer, would not have recognised. Mary visited Frogmore occasionally in those last years. She was driven out from London by carriage. She went round the gardens, slowly leaning on a maid's arm. She sat on the bench Augusta had liked. She walked as far as she could along the paths the five of them had laid out in the 1790s when they were young women in their 20s. She did not, by all accounts, weep. She had, by this point, done all the weeping that her temperament would allow. She just walked, she looked, she remembered. There is a letter from Mary to one of Victoria's daughters from about 1855, which I find one of the most moving documents in this whole story. The letter describes a morning at Frogmore. Mary writes about the way the light came through the window of the music room where Augusta used to play, and how the dust was moving in the light, and how she had stood there for a long moment listening to nothing because there was nothing to listen to anymore, and how she had then, very carefully, walked out and closed the door. That is what it is to be the last sister, to walk into the room where there used to be music, and to listen to the silence there, to close the door behind you, because nobody else is going to. Mary's own decline, when it came, was gradual. She had been well into her 70s, then she was 80, then she was 81. By the spring of 1857 she had been confined to her rooms for several months. She did not eat very much. She slept a great deal. She received Victoria, who came to visit her several times in those last weeks, and she received Victoria's children, and she received a small, careful procession of nieces and nephews and great-nieces and great-nephews who all came, in their turn, to say goodbye to the last of the great-aunts. She died on the 30th of April, 1857, at Gloucester House in the early afternoon. The window was open. The sound of the carriages on Park Lane came in through the window, the modern London sound. The sound of a city Mary had not lived in as a young woman because she had not been allowed to. She did not speak at the end. She slipped, the way Augusta had, the way Sophia had, the way her mother had 40 years earlier, from sleep into a deeper sleep, and out of it. The doctor confirmed it. The room was quieted, the curtains were drawn, the news was sent to Buckingham Palace. Victoria, when the news reached her, wrote in her diary that the last link with her grandfather's generation was now broken, and that the loss felt, at her own age of 37, like the closing of a long chapter that her family had been turning the pages of for as long as she had been alive. Mary was buried at St. George's Chapel at Windsor, near her husband Gloucester, and not far from the brothers and sisters who had gone before her. The funeral was a small one by the standards of royalty, because Mary had asked for it to be small. Victoria was there. Several of Victoria's children were there. A few of the elderly servants who had served Mary since her own youth were there, dressed in mourning, standing at the back of the chapel with their hands folded. The 6 sisters were now, all of them, gone. I want to take a moment to sit with that. The nursery at Buckingham House in the 1770s. 6 small girls in white muslin dresses with blue ribbons. 6 pairs of small shoes lined up in the corridor. 6 small voices singing together, in German and French and English, in a room with pale green walls. The Princess Royal teaching Mary to read. Augusta playing the pianoforte in the room next door so the others could hear it. Elizabeth designing a pattern that all 6 of them would later embroider. Sophia writing a small private poem in a notebook nobody would ever see. Amelia, the surprise baby, sitting on her father's lap and being kissed on the top of the head. All 6 of them, in a single century, came into the world and went out of it. Royal in 1828 in Württemberg. Amelia 21 years before that, in 1810 at Windsor. Elizabeth and Augusta in the same year, 1840, 3,000 miles apart. Sophia in 1848 at Kensington, Mary finally in 1857 at Gloucester House. 6 sisters, 6 different beds, 6 different cities, 91 years from the first birth to the last death. The houses they had lived in began, after Mary's death, to be repurposed. Frogmore became more thoroughly Victorian. Gloucester House passed to other hands. Mary's own personal rooms there were cleared, the embroideries packed away, the small writing desk where she had kept her sister's letters carried out and stored at Windsor, where it sat for half a century until somebody, a junior archivist in the early 20th century, opened the drawers and discovered, inside, several thousand sheets of paper that had not been read by anybody in 50 years. Those papers were the letters between the 6 sisters, kept for 60 years by Mary, and before that by Sophia, Augusta, and before that, when she was still alive, by Mary's mother. Letters from the 1780s, when the Princess Royal was a young woman in her 20s writing home from the family's trip to Cheltenham. Letters from the 1790s, when Augusta was reporting on the small dramas of Windsor evenings. Letters from the 1800s, when Elizabeth was using the word nunnery for the first time in writing, almost casually, as a joke. Letters from Stuttgart, from the Princess Royal, in her long German exile, written in her careful, composed hand. Letters from Kensington, from Sophia in her last years, dictated to a maid because Sophia could no longer hold a pen. Letters from Homburg, letters from a small house at Worthing in the summer of 1807. Letters that read like the most restrained scream in the Royal Archive. Letters that read like nothing at all, except a description of a long winter afternoon in which nothing happened. The archivist read them. He passed them on. They began, slowly, in the late 19th and 20th centuries, to be properly catalogued. They are now, most of them, in the Royal Archives at Windsor. Anyone who can get in to look at them, anyone with the right credentials and the right careful hands and the right silent attention, can sit in a quiet reading room and turn the pages and see, in the careful handwriting of the eldest and the youngest and the middle 4, what it was like to be a royal princess of this particular family in this particular age. They did not become historically important. They did not achieve the things that histories are built around. They did not rule countries or lead armies or inspire revolutions. They simply lived in a beautiful castle across the long years of a failing father and a failing dynasty. They loved each other, and they kept each other company, and they passed, one by one, into the archive where they still, faintly, wait to be read. I want to take you back now to where the whole long story has been pointing. A small girl in a bedroom at Kensington Palace in the 1820s. Her name is Alexandrina Victoria. She is 4 years old, then 6, then 8. She has brown hair and blue eyes and a solemn small face that resembles her father, the Duke of Kent, who died when she was a baby, more than it resembles her mother. She lives in a suite of rooms that is shabby by palace standards. The household is run by her mother and her mother's Irish comptroller, under a strict set of rules that her mother has devised to keep her daughter safe from the influence of her dissolute uncles. Her aunts visit. They come in the carriage, one at a time, driven over from their various residences, and they are shown up to the nursery where the child is waiting in a pinafore and a white frock. Aunt Augusta comes. Aunt Mary comes. Aunt Sophia comes. Aunt Elizabeth, when she is back from Homburg, comes. Aunt Charlotte, Princess Royal, sends letters from Stuttgart with small presents enclosed. 6 women or 5 after the Princess Royal dies in 1828, 4 after that. 3, 2, then finally 1. They look at this small girl and understand that she is the answer to a question their own lives had posed and had not been allowed to answer. The aunts hold her. They read to her. They bring her small gifts. Aunt Mary brings her a doll. Aunt Augusta brings her a music book with simple songs. Aunt Sophia brings her a miniature locket on a silver chain. The child receives them politely, as she has been taught to do, and keeps them in her little rooms at Kensington, and grows year by year into the young woman she will become. Imagine, just for a moment, what those visits must have been like. Imagine being one of these aunts. Imagine being Augusta, who had loved a man she had never been allowed to publicly call her own, walking up the staircase at Kensington in 1825 to see a small niece who already, even at 6, has the bearing of someone who is going to be queen. The child has nothing the aunt was given, and everything the aunt was not. The child will marry whom she chooses. The child will have 9 children. The child will live to see her great-great-grandchildren. And here is the aunt, 60 years old, in a black silk dress with a small wrapped present in her hand and a smile fixed on her face, and the long quiet weight of her whole life inside her like a stone she is not going to put down. Picture each of the aunts, one after another, climbing those stairs. Augusta, who had had Spencer for 50 years in a corner of her life that nobody outside the family had been allowed to see, climbing the Kensington staircase with a small parcel of music. Mary, who had nursed her youngest sister through the long death of tuberculosis and her father of madness, climbing the staircase to see the only child who had survived. Sophia, who had given up a son she was never allowed to call her own, climbing the staircase to put a silver locket around the neck of a niece who would one day be photographed wearing it. Elizabeth, briefly back from Homburg, climbing the staircase with the slightly distracted air of a woman who had finally been given her own house abroad and only really came back to England now to do duties like this. Each of them sat in that nursery at Kensington. Each of them held that small child in her lap. Each of them, in the careful private way of women who have been keeping things back for 40 years, must have looked at this small girl and thought what their own mothers had thought in 1766, when the first of them was born. A creature of her very own, one survivor, everything depending now on this one small head. The aunts do not all live to see Victoria become queen. The Princess Royal dies before Victoria's accession. Augusta and Elizabeth die 3 years after it, in 1840. Sophia dies a decade later, in 1848. Only Mary, the beautiful, quiet second to youngest, lives long enough to see her niece fully into middle age, the family so abundantly restored that the nunnery of her own youth begins to seem like a story from a different country. Victoria is 18 when she inherits the throne, in June 1837. At 19 she has her coronation. At 20 she marries. At 21 she becomes a mother. She will bear 9 children. She will live to be 81, the same age Mary lived to. Her grandchildren will number 40, and her great-grandchildren 37. Her descendants will sit on thrones across Europe, and the British dynasty her grandfather and grandmother had so very nearly failed to continue will, through her, become the most reproductive royal house in the world. And that is what the nunnery becomes in the end. A story told occasionally by Queen Victoria to her own children, who found it hard to believe. Told by the royal biographers of the later 19th century, who softened the edges of it. Told by the archivists of the 20th century, who catalogued the letters and began to put the real story together. The nunnery dissolves. The sisters fade. Their portraits hang in the corridors at Windsor, where anyone walking past can see them. 6 women in white muslin dresses, with blue ribbons in their hair, standing together or sitting together, looking at the painter with the same direct eyes. If you go to Windsor today, you can see their portraits. There is one in particular, a group portrait painted in the 1780s, when the older 3 were grown, but the younger 3 were still small. Royal stands in the centre, a young woman of about 20, looking directly at the painter. Augusta is to her right, holding a piece of music. Elizabeth, to her left, has a sketchbook. Mary, 10 years old, leans against royal skirts. Sophia, 8, sits on a low stool. Amelia, the baby, is not yet born when this portrait is painted, but later painters would add her in, so there are versions of the picture in which all six are together, even though they were never, in life, all together at the ages depicted in the picture. I find that detail strangely moving. The painter, decades after the original painting, going back and adding the youngest sister into a family group she had not yet been born into, as if to say, no, this is the right number. This is the family. There were six of them. Put her in another part of Windsor, in a small room that not everyone gets to see. There is a glass case with some of the things that were retrieved from the sisters' lives. There is one of Princess Royal's embroideries. There is a sketchbook that belonged to Elizabeth, with a half-finished drawing of a window at Frogmore. There is a small piece of music in Augusta's handwriting, an arrangement of a hymn that she had played as a duet with Amelia in the 1800s. There is a small leather-bound notebook that belonged to Sophia, with poems in it that have never been published. There is a glove, a single white kid glove that belonged to Amelia, found in the bottom of a drawer in 1850 after Mary cleared the house at Frogmore for the last time. And there is a writing desk, Mary's own, with the little compartments where she kept her sister's letters. The compartments are empty now. The letters have been moved to the archives, properly catalogued, but the desk is there, with its small inlaid wood pattern, and you can put your hand on the top of it, if the case is open and you have permission, and feel where Mary's own hand rested for 40 years. I have thought a lot putting this story together, about what is worth carrying away from it. Not, I think, a moral, not a tidy reading of who was to blame and who was to forgive. The daughters themselves were not victims exactly. They were intelligent women who lived inside the constraints they had been given, and who, with various small private rebellions, with secret loves and quiet poems and beautifully designed embroideries, made what lives they could. What I take away is something more like the texture of their days, the 30 years of castle corridors, the smell of beeswax, the bells of St. George's Chapel marking the hours, the long terrace walks where, in any given week, the cloud over a particular tree could tell you what time it was, the embroidery frames in their pools of lamplight, the letters carried back and forth across a continent at war, the kept ring, the locked case, the unspoken son, the youngest sister with Fitzroy's letters in a box beside the bed and the November dark coming down outside the window, Mary in a wooden chair beside that bed, holding the basin, putting the letter back, Augusta following the Queen out of the dining room without turning her head, year after year, Elizabeth drawing the gardens at Kew under snow with a hand that gave nothing away, Sophia walking out into the kitchen garden in 1812 to look at the apple trees, Royal kissing Mary on the forehead on the steps of Gloucester House and getting into the carriage and not coming back. Mary in 1855 listening to the silence in the music room at Frogmore and closing the door. And one more thing, I take away the fact that they had each other. Whatever else was withheld from them, that, finally, was not. They were loved by each other, intelligently and patiently, across decades of shared small rooms. When Sophia got into trouble, the others closed around her. When Amelia was dying, the others sat with her in shifts. When the Princess Royal sent her letters home from Stuttgart, the others read them aloud by the same fire, year after year. When the nunnery finally dissolved, the four who were still in England wrote to each other almost every week for the rest of their lives. When each of them died in turn, the surviving ones gathered, by letter or in person, to absorb the loss. When Mary was the only one left, she carried them with her, all 5 of them, for 9 more years, into rooms they had never been in a London they had never quite been allowed to live in a world they would not have recognized. She carried them, and when she could not carry them any further, she went to join them, and the family they had always been was, finally, complete on the other side of the door. They had been put together by an accident of birth in a household that became, by slow degrees, a kind of cage. And inside the cage they had built, between them, a thing that was not the lives they had wanted, that was on its own terms real. That is what I will carry from this story. Not the silence of the castle, not the locked drawer of letters, but 6 women who, having been given so little, made out of it as much as anyone could have made. If you enjoyed tonight's evening with the Forgotten Daughters of King George III, I would love it if you would subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from. Tell me what time it is for you, and what you can hear outside your window, and which of the 6 sisters has stayed with you. There are more stories to tell, more lives to follow, more candles to light, and if you know someone who loves the Regency period, or the Bridgerton world, or the stories of women who lived inside the walls of their own families, please share this with them. They were 6. They were born into love. They were held beyond their time. They kept each other company through the long years. They grew old in beautiful rooms. They passed, one by one, into the silence the archive keeps. And the silence, if you lean close enough, is not silence. It is the sound of their needles moving through the linen, the soft turning of their pages, the quiet voices of their letters, still speaking from the drawers they were folded into 200 years ago. Good night.